Hi there. I'm Rabbi Nancy Flam, and I want to share a few words with you about Psalm 27. But before we start, I'd like to ask you just to pause this video. If you haven't taken a read of Psalm 27 recently, why don't you find it and spend a few minutes reading it? I suggest reading it slowly and allowing it to just progress verse by verse, but not hurrying. Just sit with it for a few minutes and then come back to the video. So I'm going to share with you one reading of Psalm 27. There are many, many ways to read this psalm. And what I'm going to share is simply the way that this psalm hit me this year as I'm preparing for the Yamim Noraim, the high holidays in this month of Elul. There's no definitive read of any psalm, and certainly not this psalm, but I want to share with you what struck my heart. Also, I want to say that even if King David isn't the author of the book of Psalms, I'm going to refer to the psalmist with what I imagine would be the poet's historically appropriate chosen pronoun, him. So this year, as I get into the heart and the mind of the narrator of Psalm 27, I begin to inhabit a profound existential uncertainty. I really feel his desire and his need to trust in God's unwavering protection. And he tries to convince himself of this trusting certitude, but ultimately, I would say his essay is unconvincing. He starts out with this great shout of affirmation. God is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? God is the stronghold of my life. Whom shall I dread? When evil people come to destroy me, they're incapable of hurting me. And in the future, even if a whole camp of fighters were to assail me, lo yirali bi, my heart will not fear. Bezot ani boteach, I can trust this. And then we read the beautiful verse, which is one of several that we might be most familiar with in this psalm. Achat sha'alti. I ask just one thing of God. This is what I seek. Ota avakesh. And what would that be? To sit in God's house every day and gaze upon God's beauty. To visit the temple day by day. Metaphorically, I want to be welcomed into God's house, because, and I find this key word, this Hebrew word key, because really illuminating. I want to be welcomed into God's house, because, as we learn in the next verse, it's there in God's house that God will shelter me and protect me, keep me hidden. Yitzbaneni, Yastireni, keep me hidden and protected from all evil. So up to this point, we have a quite grand set of proclamations regarding God's unwavering protection. That's what God delivers, and that's what I want. But then in verse 7, I sense a crack, and you might too, in the boldness. At this point, I imagine the psalmist rather breathless after such a long run of declarations and proclamations. And what happens in this pause when he takes a breath? The little voice of vulnerability and doubt and uncertainty creeps in. Oh God, hear my voice when I cry out. Be gracious to me and answer me. Chaneni va'aneni. These are the same verbs we use when we cry out plaintively in Alvinu Makenu, Chanenu V'anenu. The psalmist says, when I cry out, hear my voice, look upon me with favor, answer me, be merciful. In a word, be sure to help me. So it's that little pause, I think, that allows perhaps even the growing vulnerability, if you want to look underneath those bold proclamations, it allows that vulnerability to break through. And then this request, Achat Sha'alti, the one thing I want to ask of God is to be in God's house and be protected there. This request is followed by more pleas, variations on the central theme, petitioning God's protection. Verse 9, don't abandon me. Don't hide your face from me. Don't thrust me aside. Verse 12, don't give me up to my enemies. Al. It's the negative. Don't. So we can sense the fear. We can sense it right there. And then tellingly, as if in a murmur, the psalmist reflects, Lule he'amanti. If I didn't have the assurance that I would see God's goodness in the land of the living, and then he can't even finish the sentence. This is not a full sentence. There's like an ellipsis, an understood ellipsis at the end of that verse. The verse breaks off and the thought remains unfinished. Just considering not having God's assurance of protection is too awful to bear. Yeah, just even considering that God might not come through. And so then finally the poet cinches up his metaphorical belt and concludes as if talking to himself, it feels to me, but this time in a stronger voice. Okay, there may be no certitude, but I can hope and look toward God. Look to God, be strong and have courage. Look to God, says the verse, kaveh, have hope. That's quite a roller coaster ride through the heart and mind, don't you think? Like I say, this is a psalm of profound existential uncertainty. And perhaps it demonstrates one way in which that uncertainty might express itself in our own psyches. So in this brief read, I didn't comment on all the verses of the psalm. But there's one verse in particular I left out that for me, this year is the crucial one. It's pretty much in the middle of the poem, and to me, it's central. Verse 8 begins, L'cha amar libi bakshu fanai. The verse is actually hard to translate and ungrammatical and ambiguous. It begins by saying most literally, L'cha, towards you, my heart said, seek my face. What's going on here? I think that to understand this verse, we have to realize that in the first half of the psalm, God is spoken of in the third person only. You go back and check. God is my light. God is my stronghold. God's house, God's beauty. The poet speaks about God. But then God is addressed directly when that first crack appears in verse 7, when the poet takes a breath and asks God to listen and to answer when he's in need. Hear my voice. There's a direct address there. That cry, that crack in the narrator's invulnerability leads into this next verse. My heart spoke to me, and it said, L'cha, towards you. I heard it say that. I heard my heart say, L'cha. And then as if God were speaking right there through my own heart, I heard, seek my face. And from that moment, the psalmist continues to address God directly, speaking to God as if face to face, with more intimacy and more immediacy. At the end of the poem, it's true when the psalmist has to pull himself back together, shore himself up, as I'll explain. He does at that point switch back to the third person, and that somehow makes sense to me in the dramatic sweep of how I'm seeing the psalm anyway this year. So these two middle lines, verse 7 and 8, turn out for me to be the pivots. It's the pivot from God in the third person, talking about God, to talking to God, addressing God. Seek my face, seek my face. Of course, we know from Torah that no one but Moses can see God face to face. So what might this mean? What is this seeking? Art Green writes, the quest is our longing for intimacy, for a face-to-face relationship with the divine. We long to repeat the experience of Moses, who could converse with God face-to-face like a person with his neighbor. End quote. Our scripture says pretty clearly that God has a face. In fact, the oldest and one of our most cherished blessings, the priestly blessing, says, may God shine his face upon you. But the face for a tradition that forbids any image of the divine must be a metaphor. It is, we would say, a metaphor for presence, for relationship, for a felt sense of intimate connection with the one. That's what the psalmist feels himself urged to seek. That immediacy, that connection, that sense of felt presence as we do when we're face to face with another. I love how Art Green talks about God's face. He says, we human beings put a face on the oneness of being. We put a face on the oneness of being. This is what he writes. It is we who determine that God has a face. It is by the act of saying thou, that is the intimate sense of you, thou. It is by the act of saying thou to the faceless cosmos that we give it a face and turn it from being an object into subject, creating a projected God with whom we may enter into dialogue and conversation. I'm fully aware, he writes, of the crucial role projection plays in religion and in all our images of God. It is we who take the mysterious and faceless one of the universe and make it into a human-like deity. That's our need and our right. So we put a face on the oneness of the cosmos. That's what we humans do. And we allow ourselves to use the imagination in that way to bring us closer. And so, like the psalmist during this month of Elul, we turn from talking about God in the third person to turning toward God. L'cha, my heart said, towards you. Towards you means toward a willingness to let the cosmos address me personally as it may, to let it touch my heart. I turn toward a willingness to hear you speaking to me, touching me, turning me at this season in the midst of my existential vulnerability, which I cannot escape. In the depth of my heart, within the river of beauty and fear and love and joy and sorrow that runs right through it, I turn my face to you, where you may be addressing me from the great wide cosmos. There's no assurance for any of us that we'll have total protection from harm, alas. And there's no assurance for any of us that if we seek, that we will find. But the heart says, give it a try. Seek my face. And in the end, as the psalmist concludes, if we seek and do not find, we remind ourselves to take courage, to not give up hope, to strengthen our own good heart. In a word, to keep turning. And so I'd like to close with the words of our great Paitan, the poet Judah Halevi. May his testimony strengthen us and give us hope for the journey of Elul and the Yamim Noraim. Ya ana emsacha. Ya, where will I find you? High and hidden is your place. I hear art's the oneness of the cosmos. High and hidden is your place. Transcendent. And where shall I not find you? Judah Halevi says. The world is filled with your presence. So yeah, the oneness, the transcendence, that which we cannot know and touch, and yet the whole earth is filled with God's presence. Where will I not find you, your immanence? That face can blink or shine at any moment, anywhere. Yah, where will I find you? High and hidden is your place, and where shall I not find you? The world is filled with your presence. I sought your closeness. I called you with all my heart. And going out to meet you, I found you coming toward me. A great journey toward Lecha. Kevodcha maleh olam, Kevodcha maleh olam, Mekomecha na'alev ne'elam, Kevodcha maleh olam, Kevodcha maleh olam, Kevodcha maleh olam, Mekomcha na'alev ne'elam, Kevodcha maleh olam. So I wish each of you a wonderful, deep, honest, intimate, real journey of Elul into the heart of the Yamim Noraim. Blessings.